The cognitive task I want to think about in this section is how can a brain generate a response to a situation in which a picture of an object viewed from an unusual angle is seen and the words, "What is this object?" are heard. Incidentally, this object is a pair of scissors, and it's an example I used earlier in the course. So these are the sensory inputs. How does the brain get to making an appropriate response? Let's think about an area of columns at a particular level of complexity, the level at which the receptive fields can discriminate between different categories of visual objects. Then, if you look at a pair of scissors, a number of columns will detect their receptive fields in this area. A different pair of scissors, a different set of columns, and so on. So in each instance, even of the same category, a different set of columns is activated in this area, but as we've discussed a number of times under semantic memory, for objects of the same type, because of visual similarities at this level of receptive field complexity, there are some columns that detect their receptive fields relatively often in different instances of the same category, as I've indicated by the green arrows at the bottom. Any one column isn't active in all instances of the category, and any one column is also active in response to many other categories, but some columns turn up relatively frequently, and recommendation strengths can be assigned in such a way that the brain can make good discriminations. And it's those columns that have the largest recommendation strengths in favour of saying, well, that's a pair of scissors. The problem is that when you look at the object from an unusual angle, the receptive fields with most of the recommendation strength in favour of naming the object aren't detected. And as a result, there isn't a predominant speech recommendation strength. So at the anatomical and physiological level of description, the task is to get from this directly activated population to another population that does have a strong overall recommendation strength in favour of saying that's a pair of scissors. So let's think about what kind of information the brain could draw on to achieve this. In the past, maybe you looked at a similar pair of scissors. But if you think about what you do when you see a novel object, you tend to turn it, rotate it, shift it around, look at it from all sorts of different angles. And each of these perceptions will activate a different group of columns. Of course, you may have seen different pairs of scissors, but again, you've seen them from many different angles and in quick succession. And of course, the brain will have seen many different objects and seen those objects under the same conditions. And some of the columns activated in response to different objects might be the same as columns activated in response to viewing of scissors at different angles. Now, this behaviour of rotating novel objects is common in babies, but adults do the same sort of thing as well. So, any one column has often been active in the past just before a wide range of other columns, because that column has been detected in an object viewed from one angle, and because you've rotated that object, you've seen other columns shortly afterwards. So a column can have recommendation strengths in favour of indirectly activating any of those other columns, and the brain can combine the recommendation strengths of a population of active columns to activate a particular secondary population on this basis. Because on quite a number of occasions, this correlated activity has been the result of looking at one object from a sequence of different angles, the secondary population will be a population that would tend to occur if the object driving the current population was rotated. So the population of columns directly activated in response to looking at the photograph of the object can have recommendation strengths in favour of indirectly activating other columns that tend to be the ones often active in the past shortly after the columns in that directly activated population. Now, the recommendation strengths are averages over the activity of many columns over many past experiences. So the result will be a mental image of the sort of object that will be seen shortly after the current object in response to rotation. And these recommendation strengths will be modulated by positive and negative rewards. So there's a reasonable chance that the indirectly activated columns will include some that have significant recommendation strength in favor of saying it's a pair of scissors. But of course, we don't always get it right, because we're depending on average histories over columns that detect their receptive fields in many different objects. Nevertheless, this is the way for a brain to mentally rotate objects without neurons knowing anything about either the objects or about rotation. Now, if we describe the process at this level of model, with the sensory inputs being the picture and the speech, the words drive activation of multiple populations of columns in the discriminates words area at different phases of frequency modulation. The output of these multiple populations are synchronized and released to the discriminates groups of words area, where the population that results has recommendation strength in favor of a sequence of activation behaviors, perhaps recorded in the cerebellum. And this sequence of behaviors is essentially a mental rotation. The sequence includes focusing attention on the object in the photograph, generating a population of columns in the discriminates visual objects area, then indirect activation of a secondary population in the same area on the basis of frequent past simultaneous activity just after the activity of the current population. And of course, that requires participation of other cortical areas with the appropriate receptive fields. So once again, we can understand mental rotation at this high level, and we know how to map to more precise levels as required.